The streets of Hell's Kitchen. My name is Eric, and I never believed in the supernatural, at least, not until that night in New York. The events that unfolded still haunt me, making me question everything I thought I knew about reality. This is no ordinary ghost story, nor is it a tale I tell for thrills. What happened that night is something I will never forget. It was a cold, damp evening when my best friend Danny and I decided to wander through Hell's Kitchen. Danny was always the adventurous type, pulling me into all sorts of questionable situations. New York at night had its own energy. Some parts were vibrant and full of life, while others were dark, silent, like they were hiding something sinister. Hell's Kitchen was one of those places. We were walking down an empty street when Danny suddenly stopped in front of a decrepit old warehouse. The building was abandoned, windows broken, graffiti scrawled all over its walls. It looked like the kind of place you'd see in a horror movie, the kind that everyone knew was trouble but was too curious to ignore. "You ever heard of this place?" Danny asked, his voice low, almost as if he was afraid of being overheard. I shook my head. "This here is what they call the lair," he continued. "They say people go missing here. It's where the worst of the worst used to hide out." I could tell he was excited, but there was something about the way he said it that made my skin crawl. I tried to laugh it off, but deep down I didn't want to be anywhere near that warehouse. "Let's just get out of here, Danny. This place gives me the creeps," I said, hoping he'd change his mind. But Danny, being Danny, was already moving toward the side door. He had this look in his eye, the same look he always got when he was about to do something reckless. "Come on, man. What's the worst that could happen?" he called back, pulling open the rusted metal door with a loud screech. Against my better judgment, I followed him inside. The air in the warehouse was stale, the kind of heavy air that feels like it hasn't moved in decades. Dust particles floated in the dim light from our phones, and the faint smell of mold clung to everything. Our footsteps echoed off the concrete floor, sending shivers down my spine. The deeper we went, the darker it got, until our phone flashlights were the only thing illuminating the path ahead. I wanted to turn back, but Danny kept pushing forward, his face set in determination. Then we heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins. A child crying. It was faint, barely audible at first, but there was no mistaking it. It was coming from somewhere deeper inside the building. "Do you hear that?" Danny whispered, stopping dead in his tracks. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Let's just go," I urged him again, but he didn't listen. Instead, he took a step toward the sound, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. We followed the noise down a narrow hallway, the crying getting louder with each step. Something was wrong, though. The cry wasn't natural. It sounded distorted, echoing off the walls in a way that made my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking into a trap. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar. The crying was coming from behind it. Danny reached out to push the door open, and I could see his hand shaking. Inside was a small, dimly lit room. In the center of the room was an old wooden crib. It looked out of place, like it didn't belong there. But the crib wasn't what scared me. It was what was lying inside it. At first, I couldn't make out what I was seeing. It looked like a baby, but its features were all wrong. Its eyes were too big, its limbs too long. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and it was moving, writhing like it was in pain. I stumbled backward, my heart in my throat. "What the hell is that?" I whispered, but Danny was staring at it, frozen in place. Suddenly, the crying stopped. The creature turned its head toward us, and in that moment, I knew we had to leave. and it wasn't friendly. "Danny, we need to go now," I said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the door. But as we turned to leave, we heard something else, a low growling, coming from behind us. I glanced over my shoulder, and that's when I saw them. Shadows, dozens of them, moving along the walls, getting closer. They didn't have faces, but I could feel their eyes on us. We ran. We ran as fast as we could back through the hallway, the sound of footsteps echoing behind us. I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was getting out of that building, away from whatever was chasing us. The door was still open when we reached it, and we burst out into the night, gasping for air. The shadows didn't follow us outside, but I could still feel them watching, waiting for us to come back. We never spoke about what happened that night. Not to each other, not to anyone. Danny became distant after that, as if a part of him had been left behind in that warehouse. A few weeks later, he disappeared. The police never found his body. I still think about that night sometimes, and I wonder if whatever we saw in that building finally came for him. I try not to dwell on it, but there are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear the faint sound of a child crying. And every time, I wonder if one day it will come for me too.